It is a thrill for me to have Dr. Raymond Prior on this podcast. And if you're listening on audio, go and check it out on YouTube because he sent me this book, Golf Beneath the Surface, a practical guide for composure under pressure, long-term growth, and a more fulfilling relationship with the game. Raymond, welcome. What you've summarized there, I think just about all and sundry listening to or watching this podcast are striving to. So I'm so glad you would join us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Mark. I'm looking forward to talking more about some ways that perhaps your listeners can tap into those things.
You know what? I want to say this before I have you introduce yourself. Many, many moons ago, I'm still a full-time golf instructor turned to broadcaster, but I would fix every problem with a golf swing adjustment. Because, the thing, if all you have in your tool belt is a hammer, everything in the world's a nail.
Yeah.
And then I started to grow up, maybe wisdom set in, and I started to realize how holistic everything is, especially playing golf. And the more I've done this, the more I've learned about it until I got your book. And now I'm learning even more. So with that said, I want you to introduce yourself to our global audience, please.
My name is Raymond Prior. You could call me Dr. Prior. I don't make people call me doctor, unless maybe it's people I don't really like, but that's very few people in the world. My title and my training makes me a performance consultant. My areas of quote unquote expertise are performance psychology, performance neuroscience, and sleep science. My job in a nutshell is to help people understand their mind and their brain and the things that they do in relation to the things that they want, and to be able to train their mind and their brain to do so. So you might put me under the category of sports psychology, which is fine. Mm-hmm. And my job is not to tell people what to do, only to help them understand the things that might be able to unlock some of the things that they're looking to pursue. So that in a nutshell is my job. And you can find me hopefully not very present. I try to stay very much in the background and behind the scenes as much as possible, but you will find me working with professional golfers, which is probably why I'm here today. Mm-hmm. You'll also find me pretty present in some corporate areas. And then also I work with quite a few performing artists and military members. So that's your singer-songwriters, your pop stars, as well as some of our military forces, depending on what types of things that they're doing. So kind of find me in those different performance realms, all working from those areas of expertise.
In a way, that's kind of liberating for me as I listen to you, because I'm listening to you like a fan, because there's so much that I feel like I can still learn. But when you talk about all of these other stars in their fields, from military to performance artists to business people, I've looked through your website. I mean, you work with athletes from all over the sporting realm. Everybody struggles with these things that you've written about in your book. I mean, this is not reserved, because I feel like some of the battle is when we're out there battling with ourselves on the golf course and our worlds are caving in, we feel so isolated and alone, and it's like you're on an island. So you're liberating me with just your introduction.
It might be helpful for golfers to know that you are not alone. And so much of our human psychology, as it pertains, is there's way more overlap than there are differences in different performance fields. Mm-hmm. And so it's really human psychology as applied to, and then you might fill in the blank, golf, perhaps writing, perhaps doing podcasting, whatever it might be. But there's a human being behind a performance, and what's running that human being at first and foremost is a brain.
And amazing how we're supposed to be our own best friends, right? But we can almost be our own worst enemies at times. So people talk about beating the competition. Well, you got to conquer self before you can beat competition, correct?
Well, I think there's something to be said about not necessarily maybe being our best friend or worst enemy, because in the eyes of our brains, saving you from life and limb danger or perceived threats is being your best friend. Okay. But differentiating what is being a good friend in what settings can very much be different. So, for example, if you're playing golf, you trying to save yourself from poor outcomes or uncomfortable experiences tends to be very disruptive to performance. It keeps us from thriving, mm-hmm. right? But in a different setting where life and limb might be at stake, that might be intensely beneficial for us. Yeah. You know, for example, something like anxiety, we know is very disruptive for performance in golf, but we know it can be very helpful in life-threatening situations. So it's kind of how our friendship is manifesting in our performance and in other areas of our lives that we can train in ways that can make it more conducive at times.
Incredible. Well, look, I've read some of the book. Suffice to say, it's going on the plane with me to the West Coast tomorrow, because I'm going to be all into this. Um, you've sort of teased the book a little bit already. So before we get to that, and you talked about how the brain and our, our mind works. What was the inspiration for the book? Because I'm in the process of writing one now, and I know I shouldn't date this podcast because someone might listen to this when the thing's published. But my inspiration was I've had so many smart folks on this podcast, and they've shared so much great insight that someone needs to somehow package this stuff.
Yeah.
And so I went through all of the shows because I was like, here, you need to read this kind of thing. Did you have the same moment with this, or was it another inspiration?
There's a similar thread through that, which is I wanted people to have a packaged version of what is most updated, or at least at the time of the book being published, of what we know about human psychology and neuroscience as it relates to performance in golf. As I discussed in the intro of the book, every single area of golf is growing by leaps and bounds, both in quantity and quality, through technology and through really good science.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the psychology part of it has really kept up. And there's a lot of kind of what were very effective, or what we thought were very effective modalities from many, many decades ago that still kind of ring true. You kind of hear the same truisms, the same platitudes that are kind of going around, and what I would call kind of surface level psychology that is describing what's happening and then just suggesting the opposite as the remedy to it, without really understanding the mechanistics of the psychology and the neurology underneath. Right. And so my hope was that this book would, one, inform readers better about how their brain and how their psychology is operating and what we know research is telling us, and also perhaps to challenge the status quo of psychology in golf in a way that is not trying to devalue what somebody else is doing, but to provide an alternative that might be a little bit more fitting for people based, again, on what research tells us, not my personal opinion. So the impetus of the book was to try to provide some value to people in a way that is, here's an updated, little bit more in-depth version that then might help you be able to understand yourself, your game, and then therefore simplify it on the course rather than hoping your brain can do it on the fly.
I love it because, like I mentioned to you, I think before we went hot, I passed it on to my daughter, my eldest, who's now she's talented, but becoming a competitive golfer. Mm-hmm. And you know the challenges of that, right? Everyone listening to this, we've all been there. And I just read what I guess would have been the foreword. It wasn't titled as so. And at the end of it, you write, to any golfer, teaching professional, coach, administrator, or parent who seeks to understand golf in a deeper and more sustainable level, build more consistent performance, understand yourself and others, and enjoy the game more, this book is dedicated to you. And I was like, yeah. Your comment there.
That's what it's for. I've been fortunate enough to be around in golf. I had a very circuitous entry into the golf, especially the high performance golf community. And since I've been there, I've been able to interact with so many people that are really indeed the common ground between everybody in and around golf is trying to help people perform better and enjoy the game more. And I want to just, in the book, people, it's not just for them, it's for the people around them as well. So that is really my homage, hopefully, to them, that when they pick up this book, it's not just for the guy or girl who's trying to win a major, it's also for the people around everyone trying to get a little bit better at a game that is very difficult to get better at.
Goodness, every great golfer I've had on the show, from Jordan Spieth to Justin Thomas to Ernie Els, you ask them about coming up, and they all spoke of the influence of the parents.
That's right.
And I think, and I'm one of those now, not just podcast host. Our job is as important as any, the folks who are around the competitive golfer, because like I always say to the competitive golfers I teach, I'm like, look, the buck stops with you because you've got your hands on the rubber end of the golf club, but the support mechanisms around said individual are very important too.
Yeah, I'll put a little bit of personal influence on this one, less more about research, but it's been my observation that nobody becomes successful alone. And who you surround yourself with and what they bring to you might say, your blast radius around you is really important. And that is a difficult thing to do for coaches and for parents when you have particularly children growing up, because everything you do is going to influence them in one direction or another, until hopefully you are helping them develop their own influence over themselves. And that is a tricky balance. There's no cut and dries in that area for the most part.
Okay, if we were in sales, I'm sure we've sold this book now.
Sure.
Stay till the end so you can find out where to get it. You kicked this whole thing off with a story that when I read, I sort of smiled and maybe I shed a tear at the same time because I've lived this. I've lived this, and you were with a friend, I believe it was, and you were at a golf tournament at Aronimink, which is a really good golf course, hard.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was a client, but there's a young lady golfer coming up there. She's in contention. She hits on the green 20 feet final hole and proceeds to three putt, ending what was a really good day without a real exclamation point, but
Mm-hmm.
something more depressing and disappointing. And you add the list of adjectives there. And I found it curious you would start with that. So I want you to share the story because I feel like it's a good kicking off point to get into what you write about the brain and such.
Yeah, that story is a kicking off point. So I was um, just observing the couple final groups. This was the women's PGA Championship a few years ago at Aronimink, and it's a really good example because I think it's something that many golfers have experienced in one form or another, which is my performance was going really well right up until it wasn't, and the way my brain and body reacted kind of got in my way. And so just to try to tee up that story is because I wanted to lead it into how does our brain actually operating. So the question that the person I was standing next to asked is, why do we get nervous or why do we respond that way? And the reason isn't because some character flaw or my training is ineffective, so on and so forth. It's because our brain is exactly designed to know when stakes matter very much to us and to kick off a cascade of physiological reactions to try to mobilize us for that. But it doesn't always do so in the most efficient way.
I was about to say because it's crazy because every golfer listening to this, you feel sometimes you feel invincible. Everything's going your way. Then all of a sudden you go from hero to zero and you try and think about this logically, and you're like, what the heck happened? I mean, I was doing just fine. Now I feel like I can't hit the golf ball. It's a crazy, crazy thing that you happen to explain very well in this.
Yeah, and things can shift very quickly, particularly in high stakes environments. And if you're playing professional golf, it is indeed a high stakes environment. Like there's a significant amount of social risk, financial risk, competitive risk, sometimes physical risk, depending on what the situations are. And your brain is designed to be in tune to risk.
Yeah.
And when it perceives that there's enough risk involved, not necessarily threat, but risk, it's going to mobilize because that's what it is exactly designed to do. And that's the mechanisms behind us getting nervous. It's a stress response. Now, to be very clear, stress and anxiety and nerves are not the same. Stress is intensity and duration of demand. So playing in a major is a very stressful performance venture.
Mm-hmm.
Nerves is a stress response that is our brain and body mobilizing to handle that stress.
Okay.
That's the activation of our nervous system. That's how we feel butterflies. That's the blood pumping from our internal organs and our digestive ways out to our arms and limbs to make us more activated for potential need to either I need to do something to pursue the resources I want or the things I want, or perhaps defend myself from what I don't.
Yeah.
But think of nerves as more of it's a bit of a neutral activation.
Okay.
It's like, hey, we need to be ready to do something, but I'm waiting for you to tell me what.
Okay. Right. Mm-hmm.
Anxiety, on the other hand, feels highly activating for our nervous system, but it is a psychological state characterized by worry about the future. And so we can perform really well through nerves because they are perhaps something that offers us the option for pursuit-based activation. Anxiety will automatically move avoidance of risk to the top of the priority list for our brain. And that's what keeps us from pursuing playing well and trying to make us play to not screw up. And you don't have to be a psychologist to figure out we don't typically play very well trying to not screw up.
Yeah. It reminds me of I'm going to quote, this is not verbatim, but I had spent some time around Coach Lou Holtz once or twice back in the day. And I remember him saying he was in a typical coaching moment. It was in the clubhouse there at a golf course. And he talked about being nervous and being anxious. And he said he would always ask his players the following question. He goes, if you can answer yes to these questions, then what you're feeling is positive. And the questions were, have I prepared and do I believe I belong? And if you say yes and yes, he goes, well, then what you're feeling is going to make you better. But if one of the answers to those are no, well, then it's kind of I would say debilitating. But I always found that curious because it was accurate. But I was like, okay, so what if I did answer no, but I'm still in the situation and
Yeah.
I would still perform? So I
Yeah,
guess this is where you come in.
that's a really good question. So there's certainly something to be said about preparation.
Yeah.
And again, so I would never tell any client, you should go underprepared, right? Because that's certainly not helpful. The more prepared we are for things, and not necessarily more being as much as possible, but am I prepared enough for the stress that I'm about to enter is a really important thing.
Okay.
The self-belief part is an interesting wrinkle to that, because on the surface, we as humans go, well, if I feel like I belong or I feel like I deserve, that will then move me through. But then you ask the question, well, what if I don't?
Yeah.
And what our research shows us is that actually self-belief can be very, very powerful for us, not required, and not nearly as powerful as we think it is. If we look at really, really elite performers, many of them have a thread of self-belief that is just like this unwavering, like I just feel like I'm great and it's going to be good. But they are actually the exception to the rule. More often, high performers have three psychological characteristics that separate them from others. And the first is actually a sense of inadequacy, which is I'm not really sure that I'm good enough. The second is, though, they have a belief that if I put in enough effort and I'm prepared and I'm doing the work and I'm continually learning and testing my skills along the way, I might be.
Okay.
And then the third, and these, if you're reading my book toward the end, or if you're familiar with the psychological kind of more modern literature, these are the two elements of a growth mindset, which is always operating from the question, where is my current ability actually? And how can I get a little bit better? Right. So it's not this unwavering belief that I can be great. Oftentimes, high performers, especially the elite of the elite, have a sense of, I'm not sure if I'm good enough, but I'm pretty sure I can be if I do the right things.
Okay. Right.
The third thing they have is impulse control, which is they have developed a series of habits and behaviors that are highly conducive to performance. And impulse control, to be very clear, is not that I don't feel impulses to do things that might not be helpful. It's that I can recognize those impulses, pop a timeout in one way or another, and perhaps choose to do something that is in my best interest, not necessarily the interest of my immediate comfort or certainty, right? So there are a couple of layers to that, and you're getting to kind of what modern psychology is pulling out for us, is which a lot of these kind of long-standing platitudes and catchphrases, at some point we go, well, okay, well, what if that's not in place? And then, because if I have the requirement, I have to believe in myself unconditionally, and I'm not doing that, well, now my brain and body is designed to respond to, uh-oh, we're in trouble. And now I'm in defense mode, not go try to perform as well as you can, get some feedback on it, and actually you're okay type of a stuff. So there's some wrinkles to that for sure.
Fascinating. Okay, that was personal. Let me get back to the script here. So in section 1, this is where you talked about this LPGA player who was playing well and then ruined it, and you were pitched the question, now why does that happen? And then in the section you delve into, it's basically, the section is called Your Brain.
Mm-hmm.
And delve into the old brain versus the new brain. So characterize those, contrast them, and explain the characteristics thereof to the listener, please.
Sure. Our brain is this pretty complex organ as relates to organs, but if we're trying to simplify it down a little bit, we can think of it as old brain and new brain. If you were going to make a fist with one hand, this would represent your old brain. Okay. And what's important about this part is that it is the fastest and the strongest parts of our brain. So when it comes to operating functions, this is the part of our brain that's running things automatically. So our habits, for example, it's also the part of our brain that just so happens to be kind of the threat detection part of our brain. Okay. And the reason it's the fastest and strongest is many, 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 many years ago, when the world was a much more dangerous place and we weren't really interested in thriving as much as surviving, we needed the fastest, strongest parts of our brain to be making decisions about what we did. Essentially, pessimists survived way back when, right? So because thriving wasn't really on the table.
May I stop you real fast?
Sure.
I came to this interview off a on-course lesson with a client.
Yeah.
And maybe it was kind of serendipitous, but the client was doing really well and then had a bad hole. And then I made an observation and they're like, well, no, I'm not that way inclined. I'm a realist.
Yeah.
And I looked at them, I'm like, well, okay. And I wasn't really sure how to proceed, but the optimist in me started to talk to them about what you've done, how you are equipping yourself for success. And what this was a road. It was not a roadblock, it was a bump in the road, maybe a blip on the radar. But
Yeah.
what you say about the pessimists surviving, I guess the realists were the same way inclined, right?
Yeah, if we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of psychological science, we can pull apart optimism and pessimism if you like, which I do in the last section of my book. But in this certain case, what realism really is just marginalized pessimism. It's like, well, I'm going to assume that things are only going to be this certain way. But again, it's still us just projecting a future in the way that we see it based on our past experiences or the own personal valence that we put on it. It's not. So the future is always imagined for us. And so what we imagine it is just coming from us and how we've kind of filtered through our past events. So saying I'm a realist is not any different than saying I'm a pessimist or an optimist. It's this is what I'm projecting in the future. And I'm just assuming that there's just some of things can be good or bad, but not that good. And, bad things happen,
Yeah.
which again, you can argue how real that is in the world, but, saying you're a realist is kind of another way of saying I'm pessimist light.
Okay. So to get me back on track here, so the old brain, I'm holding up my fist if you're watching on YouTube.
Yeah.
So Raymond. Um, that is, you list all the characteristics, but threat detection or basically projecting into the future for a possible event. And it's there to protect.
Yeah, we'll reel back a little bit. So this part of our brain doesn't necessarily project into the future. That's
Okay.
part of our young brain, but we'll get there in a second.
Right.
What is important about this old brain is the fastest and strongest, and it doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's perceived. Right.
Okay.
So hence what kept us alive so many, many years ago is whether it was a real threat, saber-toothed tiger, or a perceived threat, rustling in the bushes. If it assumed real threat, because you only had to be wrong once way back when to be
Yeah.
dead,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it overestimates threat in terms of what it perceives to be a threat, and then it runs our stress response. So the fastest, strongest parts of our brain. So why we get nervous very quickly and perhaps without us going, okay, do I need to be nervous about this? Is that this is the part of our brain that is designed to activate us when stakes matter and there's risk involved without us having to consciously think through it, which is, again, it's a survival mechanism for us. It makes us more well equipped to handle stress, but again, it's not necessarily anxiety. So why we feel nervous, that's that physiological cascade of my heart rate moves up, my breathing rate increases to get that blood from my abdomen out to my arms and legs. And while I feel sweaty and all the things that come with feeling nervous that are somewhat physiologically uncomfortable for us, that's the part of our brain that activates our sympathetic nervous system, which is the upregulating, making me more activated type of part of our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Our young brain, if you were to take that fist, which is your old brain, and wrap your other hand over the top of it, that
Yeah.
represents our young brain, which is the slower, weaker part of our brain, but also the part of our brain that can think rationally, think consciously, make intentional choices, and project into the future or perhaps dwell on the past.
All right.
The difference between nerves and anxiety from a neurological standpoint is where they come from also. So nerves comes from our old brain. It's our old brain doing exactly what it's designed to do when we're under stress.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety comes from our young brain. That's our prefrontal cortex going, uh-oh, there's risk here. What if this happens? What if this happens? Uh-oh, don't let this happen. And playing out uncertainty in however many different infinite scenarios that it could play out, oftentimes assuming the worst case scenario. And when my prefrontal cortex does that in two ways, one, long enough, so frequently enough, or intensely enough, meaning threatening enough, my old brain will start to take over and actually shuts down our prefrontal cortex because it's faster and stronger and it can do so. Okay. So when we are anxious, the reason we default to avoidance is because our brain goes, you have projected a future that is very much worth worrying about. I don't know the difference between whether it's imagined, which it is, or whether it's real, it might be. So I'm just going to take over and put us into defense mode. So now my nerves plus anxiety is now I'm essentially playing multitasking with avoidance. If you're talking about human motivation, we can either be motivated to pursue or motivated to avoid. Where a lot of golfers go, I don't play very well or I'm not committed. It's not because they're not committed. It's because they're asking their brain to go pursue this shot in this way. And dear God, don't let this happen, which is not a negative thought. It's an avoidance-based task. And these are conflicting tasks. They're moving in opposite directions, stemming from the future that I have projected that told my old brain, you need to be worried about this. And it doesn't know the difference between whether it should or shouldn't.
Golly. Okay, I could camp out here for a little while, but I do want to ask one question. Um, the proliferation of anxiety, especially in young people.
Yeah.
I mean, goodness gracious me, it's rampant. And I hate to say the first response, but it appears to me, as I watch it from far out, kind of the 36,000 foot view, medication is given to people or prescribed. And that just, I guess, that numbs or dulls this response. Is that what is happening?
Yeah. So to your first point, Mark, we are living in the age of anxiety for human beings. There's no doubt about the rates and the intensity and the frequency and the minimum age which people start experiencing, not just state anxiety, which is I'm in a situation that might require anxiety, but more what we call trait. It's not really trait because it's not a genetic thing, but it's just ongoing anxiety as a kind of a constant for them is becoming more and more. The vast majority of people I work with, anxiety is a significant portion of why they're coming to see me. Medication can be very helpful for some people. The caveat to that is assuming that you're also doing the other things that or changing some things that you might be doing to create that anxiety. We often learn anxiety from core beliefs from adults, mostly the way they respond to things that we do, the type of feedback that we get from adults, even praise, by the way, the type of praise that you give a young person will oftentimes influence the type of anxiety that they develop and how it becomes deployed for them. Similarly, for those paying attention, the way we use cell phones and we get dopamine specifically influences the type of anxiety we experience and how frequent and how intense. And I'll just dive into that just a little bit, so now leave people on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, it's real. That what you say there. I mean, you hit me squarely between my eyes with a cell phone.
Yeah. So dopamine is a neuromodulator in our brain that makes effort feel good. It's a reward for our efforts, right? So again, many thousands of years ago, if you stalked that woolly mammoth all day, it made that stalking worthwhile for us without necessarily needing the outcome at the end of it. Similarly, if you found water or you found food along the way and you consumed it, you would get rewarded with dopamine because that's what made us remember, hey, if you can get this, you should get it. It helped us to gain the resources we need either via effort or via path of least resistance. So there's kind of two pathways that we get dopamine. One is earned, meaning I need to face risk. There's some vulnerability involved. There's some sacrifice. There's effort involved. This is why when you go have a really hard workout, you kind of feel good during it once you get into it and afterward.
Yeah.
But to be very clear, that earned dopamine requires agitation to begin with.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to risk something or sacrifice something to go get it.
From my cold plunging, I feel so good afterwards, right?
There you go. So your cold plunge is going to increase your plasma dopamine levels by like 530%, which is going to be this kind of long lasting boost in energy and focus. It also comes with norepinephrine, which is just another way of saying energy. So your cold plunge, yeah, awesome. So there's a reason why that's kind of a fad lately.
It sucks before the time. You look at the water, you're like, oh, geez, really?
Exactly, right? So it requires you to engage with discomfort in order to get the bonus from it. What happens for us cell phones, and the reason it starts to create anxiety for us, is that it's an unearned source of dopamine. All I had to do was the direct behavior to get it. Meaning it's the same thing as I drink some alcohol, I eat a cookie. The only thing I had to do was the thing to get it with no risk, no sacrifice, no effort. Now, again, this isn't a bad thing, but our brain is designed to go path of least resistance when it's available to us. So not only am I getting dopamine very, very quickly without the sacrifice required for it, which means my threshold for the amount of work and the amount of sacrifice and the risk I'm willing to take to get that dopamine is dropping, which means the bar for what makes me feel anxious and think in anxious ways is getting lower. My threshold is dropping.
That makes okay. Yeah.
Right. And so as this is happening, and then when I feel that anxiety and that risk that I'm anxious about, I tend to go to the thing that makes me feel better, which is more swiping and scrolling. Right. So it's this kind of cycle. It's the same reason we get addicted to cigarettes or addicted to alcohol. What happens is our nervous system, especially with dopamine, it's like a scale. If you tip it toward pleasure first, there's a longer kickback toward pain in the other direction, and vice versa. The more you kick it to pain, the more you get a pleasure response in the opposite direction longer.
Interesting.
Now, this is important because when you continually tip this scale toward pleasure, your threshold for pain gets lower, and what makes you in pain also becomes like wider.
Yeah.
So the more we engage with things that just make us feel better without us having to earn something with it, the more we are priming our brain for things like depression and anxiety. just from a neurochemical level. The other part of social media, which again, we're a little bit off kilter, but I think this is important for people to know,
You are
is that
changing people's lives right now, Raymond.
If you are engaging with social media more, what you're ultimately also going to see is some airbrushed, curated version of everybody else's life, that even on a subconscious level, you go, well, my life's not that good. My life's not that good. And if all I did was point out that your life, even though there's some really great things in it, doesn't compare to the best 1% and broadcasted version of everybody else's life, that's a recipe for anxiety and depression. And we know this particularly affects young women, especially because, there's some body image stuff involved with that. And also just like my quality of life is not the quality of life of everyone else. By the way, no different than a pro golfer going down the range and going, that guy's swing or that girl's swing or that guy's swing, right? So this comparison where the disparity between where I am and where everybody else is also a really anxiety provoking experience. And so this is why we see the research showing that the more people are engaging with easy sources of dopamine, their levels of anxiety and the frequency and intensity are much higher. Again, not because it's some character flaw. It's exactly how our brain is designed to operate in that type of a setting.
Goodness gracious me. It's almost like you've done a sales job just for the golfers listening, human beings. But like, right, you're going to feel better if you go out and you go and have that hard session on the range, or you go and try and learn to hit the shot that you never did, because the success you're after, man, that's fantastic.
It does. And when we stick with that let's say you're trying to learn a new shot and your coach has prescribed you some drills that are indeed quite difficult for you and include a certain level of failure. The agitation is what triggers learning in your brain. If you don't stick with it through that agitation, and your brain will not reward you with the dopamine for staying in it, but also without the agitation, the cortisol, which is an agitating kind of stress hormone for us, and then the dopamine with it, it won't release the chemicals that then trigger learning, which then your brain will go and rewire while we're sleeping. So when people try something hard and then quit on it early, it's not just that you quit, like, okay, you can make a kind of a moral or ethical argument about it or a discipline argument, but also you haven't given your brain the conditions to be able to actually learn in the long term.
Okay, I just want to point out something too. I mean, that was all fantastic, but you said something, your brain will rewire itself when you're sleeping. I want you to explain that, because I've heard this, but you suddenly made the whole thing seem very sensible. I had that, like I said to you, that aha moment. So, so we've practiced, we've done the uncomfortable, we're drilling, life is sucking, but I'm sticking to it. It's not like the change is happening there. The change is happening when we laid our heads on the pillow in the evening.
That's right. So you can think about your practice during waking hours as triggering learning. Very specifically, a certain types of chemicals, when we are focused on something, you might think of our dopaminergic system like a Bluetooth. It pairs to what we're focused on and what we're engaging with. When we stick with it through the difficult stuff long enough for our dopaminergic system to go, okay, we're doing this. This is what we're focused on. We're not bailing out of it. That dopamine is running. We're in a state of neuroplastic triggering, and our brain is releasing a chemical called acetylcholine, which serves a variety of functions. One of them is it acts like a highlighter marker. So when you're training, let's say you're trying to hit a draw after hitting a slice, and you're doing a drill, and even though you might not be getting the outcomes you want, when you repeat a motion, your brain is literally highlighting, here's a neural pathway to change, here's a neural pathway to change, here's one to create, and it's laying down the framework, kind of painting the blueprints for it. But neuroplastic change only happens while we're sleeping. So if you went and got the best lesson of your life or played the best round of your life, if you don't sleep well enough at night, you're getting very little of that. And so the power of sleep is not just it's a recovery, which it is, but also if we want to be a long-term learner, if you're not sleeping enough, your brain cannot physically make the neuroplastic changes that you have been trying to direct during your waking hours.
It's just amazing. You learn these things that sort of get handed down through generations, and, babies need to sleep to develop. So you're saying,
so do we.
Exactly. Us adults need to as well. And we're all getting by on little sleep, and it's interrupted. And I wear a Whoop recovery band.
We could do a whole podcast or 5 on sleep, and maybe we'll do that in the future. Sleep is a foundational component to anything performance and health related, which we could get into at another time. But the long and the short of it, as it pertains to our old brain and young brain, old brain is where nerves come from. It's our threat detection center in our brain. It's our stress detector, but it is mobilizing us for both pursuit and avoidance. It's still waiting for us to tell it which one.
All right.
So that's why when there are times when we feel nervous and we're like, okay, I got an opportunity in front of me, it feels really good. There are also times where you go, oh, wow, stakes are here. I'm worrying about what's going to happen. Or, oh, what if this happens? Where now the anxiety starts to then move that nerves and the stress response toward avoidance. And it doesn't take a psychologist to figure out that that is a less enjoyable and a lower performing option for us, constantly multitasking with avoidance based in the future.
That's awesome. I wanted to touch this quickly too, but I think you've already sort of weaved your way through the conversation. Because one of the things I jotted down here was you wrote that you can change the brain by training the mind. I'd like you just to elaborate there a little bit, please.
That's neuroplastic change.
Okay.
So neuroplasticity by definition is our brain's ability to change based on our experiences. So let's say, for example, I wanted to train my focus. If I do mindfulness practice, which is one of our more efficient means of training focus over time, and there are a variety of different ways you can do this. Some of the practices have been around for thousands of years, and now there are some neuro measuring devices that can certainly help with this. We like do like neuro peak training or something like this, where when I do that thinking differently or interacting with my own thoughts and focus differently, my brain is changing those neural pathways while I sleep in the same way that it would if I'm in the gym and I stress my muscles differently. They are also going to adapt. And it's not just the muscles, but the neural pathways in my brain that move those muscles at the same time. So when we use our brain differently, our mind differently, think about things differently, respond to things differently, interact with our own thoughts and feelings differently, our brain rewires over time. And if you're younger, particularly under the age of 25, that neuroplastic change happens faster. When we're younger, our brain is designed to create new neural pathways. When we get about over the age of 25, it's actually designed to preserve those neural pathways. So it is indeed harder to make change when we're older than when we're younger. But the process is still the same, which is if I do something different long enough, my brain will rewire to move me toward that. This is why it's hard to make swing changes. If you've been swinging the club one way for however long, your brain has created very efficient neural pathways that it is designed to preserve. So that when I go do something different, I'm asking my brain to rewire, and that does indeed take a little bit of time.
Tremendous. Golly, this does sound like more podcasts. Okay, I've kept you for a long time, so I want to whistle through these.
Sure.
I did want to touch on these things because I went to your website and had a look at what you do. And look, it's all fascinating. But you listed a few things: composure under pressure, resilience to adversity, and high performance habits. I feel like you sort of touched on those too, but would you just kind of, butterfly kiss those a little bit each, just to
Yeah, of course.
almost give the fan and the listener and the watcher of this marching orders, if you will,
Yeah, of course.
in the book to learn?
So if everything that you've just touched on are kind of sections 2, 3, and 4 of the book. So
All right.
section 1 is, do I understand my brain so that it's not a surprise to me why it interacts in the way that it does? Like, you don't need to be a neuroscientist, but having a fundamental understanding of how your brain works is like having a fundamental understanding about how your arms work, so that you can understand how to deliver the golf club in a way that is more efficient, right? Or why a certain movement doesn't do it as well.
May,
Okay.
may I ask you this real fast? Because as a golf teacher, I love a good training aid that allows you to hit a golf ball. And I'm big on drills. Since me starting to teach golf in 1996 up until now, you come for a lesson with me. I'm going to explain the concept to you, the why of it, explain to you what your tendencies are,
Mm-hmm.
what you might see if you do this, and then I'm going to give you a drill or something to go and do. So
Yeah.
that drill is just, I know it's muscular, but essentially it's changing the mind. Am I summarizing it correctly?
It'll change the brain. So again, anything we do differently physically is gonna lead to rewiring in our brain, provided we do it enough and consistently enough for it to change. So, you're kind of getting along like, yes, it's a muscular skeletal movement, but that movement can't happen without a command from the brain. And the more I give a different command from my brain, the more my brain will rewire to give that command more efficiently. But it does indeed take time. And that's, again, assuming that you're sticking with that agitation long enough and then pairing that with really good sleep.
Yeah, in the book, you call the brain the supercomputer. And this
Yeah.
brings up a question, right? Because as golfer, because everyone listening to this or watching this has been there, you go for a lesson because our audience, we aspirant.
Yeah.
This is the smartest golf audience in the world here. So they listen to podcasts, they go for lessons, they want to get better. So we're in the midst of changing something to perform, but then we're like, there's a target over there, and I'm going to get the ball over there. This is the conundrum, correct?
Yeah. I think what you're kind of highlighting is, as a golfer, being really picky about when the outcome and the target are the priority, or you might say your main metric, and when the motion is the primary, right? Though many swing instructors have asked me, like, how can I get them less target oriented, them being their students? And part of explaining, like, this is not a time where we really care where the ball goes. Of course, we're eventually trying to get it to the target in the most efficient way, but right now we can't do that until we address the motion first. And I want you to focus on that for two reasons. One, it allows you to focus on doing it correctly. And two, that's showing your brain what to rewire when you then go to sleep last night, not just produce ball at target. And sometimes that's as simple as putting a net in front of where you can't see where the ball's going, and being less target and less outcome oriented during your learning, because that allows you to focus on the learning that you're doing. But ultimately, it's a target sport, so there's going to be some draw to it. But really picking apart, when are the times when the ball flight, the outcome, and the target are the priority, and when is the motion or making a change the priority? And then eventually, hopefully, you're trying to marry the two down the line.
I think I accidentally did something as an instructor smart here recently, and I'm looking for your commendation. I've done this before. Maybe it was just, I was blessed with a moment of clarity. Where I had a client, fantastic, talented, doing really well, had a hard event here to start the season. And it was a case where I could see that the game was being played almost with a handbrake up.
Mm.
There was apprehension. There was never really an unencumbered swing that was made. Everything looked like it was riddled with, oh my goodness, what if this doesn't happen? Or
Yeah.
what if it goes wrong? And I prescribed for said client, I'm like, I want you to just go and make 100 swings a day. No golf ball. Just go set the club up, just swing it, swing to balance. And so they bit, thankfully. And I went out and watched them hit the other day, and it was a different person. There was a
Yeah.
freedom. It was uninterrupted. It wasn't like there was a ball that I had to hit over there. It was like the athletic person inside the individual was coming out. Is this
Yeah, what you did is remove, in a very efficient way, what you did is remove a task that was counterproductive to what you were asking them to do. I'll just pair, there's a variety of different training. So for example, sniper school and a lot of our Olympic sport shooting teams, they dry fire far more than they're taking actual shots.
Really?
Right? Because there's a fire impulse, there's an impulse, like a recoil impulse in sport shooting, or any shooting for that matter. But then also in golf, there's a hit impulse. And so if I take the hit out of it, then I can focus on the motion that I'm trying to make. Perhaps then I get off the outcome so much, and then my brain is again starting to rewire, and I'm starting to learn, oh, this is what it feels like, this is what it produces. Then I can introduce the target or the ball later on, without that becoming the priority during my practice. So that can be very helpful, which is why just hitting and raking on the range and trying to hit a ball to a target is pretty inefficient practice, because you're just trying to produce an outcome without really engaging with, well, what's getting you there. If you watch really good professionals practice, they don't hit balls very fast.
No.
They're very deliberate with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much more of a quality over quantity thing, which, if we're talking how our brain learns, a quality rep counts a lot. But if I pair that with 10 not so quality reps, again, I'm asking my brain to hopefully pick out the one out of the 10 out of there that it's going to have a hard time doing. Because again, it's going to gravitate toward repetition, not necessarily more like a quality rep.
Dr. Raymond Prior now, Reverend Raymond Prior, I should say, speaking. Yeah, folks, practice needs some purpose. It needs to be purpose driven. I want to then just the adversity is a big thing, because
Sure.
you talked about some high performance habits and such. But look, the one guarantee about golf, and I oftentimes liken it to getting on the first tee, is like getting into a boxing ring, and you're going to take a few hits. And the person really that survives is not necessarily the best. It's just the most resilient and the person who recovers the best. So talk about that, please.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just kind of, like you said, leapfrog over the other two. So composure, if we really understand composure, it's, do I know how to stay present in high performance settings?
Okay.
right? And stay task focused. So that's what composure, and it's not necessarily a characteristic or a born in trait. It's, do I know how to stay focused on what's relevant when it's relevant? And everything that's relevant in high performance is happening in the present moment for us. It's the most valuable to us. So section 2 of the book is about mindfulness and how we train ourselves to be present more often, and also interact with our own thoughts and feelings in a way where we can be present.
Yeah.
Section 3 is about habits and how they form and how we can start to change them if we have developed habits that are not so conducive to performing at a high level. And that is really important for us, because as much as we as humans like to think we're very intentional and very rational human beings, we are very much creatures of habit, like every other animal on the planet. We have trained ourselves into a series of behaviors, and unless we're paying attention to them in a certain way in languages that our brain speaks, very difficult to just say, instead of doing this, just go do this.
Yeah.
Okay. The last section of the book is about our psychological framework. So if you think about our psychological framework, it's how we see ourselves, how we see the world, and how we see ourselves interacting within it. Our psychological framework is telling us the stories about what's worthwhile for us, what's engageable for us, what's possible for us, and what's meaningful for us, among a variety of other things. Mm-hmm. Where resilience comes from is the stories I tell myself is, when things get hard or don't go my way, it's worth it for me to stay with it rather than bail out and give up. Yeah. And it's not a character thing. It's the stories and the shapes of the beliefs, shapes meaning the way I'm thinking about things, that gives me very good reason to go, things are getting hard, stay with it. Or things got hard, it's not worth it, you should bail out. Yeah. And we bail out in a lot of ways. It can be, I'm plain scared, all the way to I quit altogether and totally leave. Like, it's amazing to me watching like a Monday qualifier where players, as soon as they figure out mathematically, I'm not so sure I'm going to make it through, there's a lot of withdrawals. Yeah. I'm not saying that's a good decision or a bad decision, but that is their psychological framework saying, if you're not mathematically available to qualify, it's time to escape, right? And so that part of resilience, we used to think resilience was just this willpower, hardiness that you just have through by just like pressure blasting people. Yeah. Where it really comes from is the psychological framework, the core beliefs that we have that tell us when things get hard, this is actually okay, and you should stay with it. And understanding what those beliefs look like allows us to be able to challenge the ones we have that aren't allowing for that, and perhaps develop ones that are.
I'm going to sound biblical now, but it sort of sounds like, there's a Bible verse that goes, there's the continual renewing of the mind. As it pertains to what you just described. I mean, that is a thing, correct? Are you building new habits?
There's something to be said about being able to learn really efficiently. Mark, the Bible verse brings in some very significant science right now, which is, it is really valuable for us to be able to relearn. Yeah. Not just physical things, not just strategies, not just how equipment works, but also relearn thinking and responding to things in ways that are more conducive to moving us toward the things that we want to. So, for example, many players learn anxiety on the low end of the learning curve, and it propels them up the learning curve. If you're a perfectionist and running through anxiety on the low end of the learning curve, where just applying effort and time and reps is going to get you better, you're going to get better. Yeah. At the top end of the learning curve, where everything requires such precision, more time, more energy, and more effort to make smaller and smaller increments of progress, that perfectionism and anxiety will burn you out, and it will keep you from performing freely and learning. And so the long and the short of it is, if I don't learn how to address the same things or similar challenges differently, or relearn how to address them, I'm stuck with whatever I've developed to begin with, which may or not be helpful for me as I pursue that.
That is fascinating. I see that on a weekly basis because, on CBS, we're covering the very best at their very best because they're contending. And, these same folks, if you catch them the following week, they might not hit the shot like they just did, but they've just been in this environment where they're allowing themselves to go. And like I was watching tennis the other day, it's like these folks just started hitting the ball harder and harder and harder. And the announcers were saying, yeah, they're not being aggressive enough. And I was like, holy cow, I think of tennis trying to get the ball in the court, where these folks were, you talk about pinpoint.
Yeah, it's very precise.
Lines, really. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing how freely we can pursue things, even with very small margins for errors, when we have self-given permission to be able to do so. If I was going to kind of put a definition to what stable confidence is, it's self-given permission to perform freely without a guarantee, which if I have that in place, there's not a surprise to me why there's so many players on both tours who are at or near the top of the leaderboard every single week. And that's because they are giving themselves permission to play freely every week. And it's not that things go perfectly for them along the way and everything's just right. But if I'm not creating any self-imposed barriers to my own performance or contaminating everything else down the line, like my core strategy, my technical skills, my equipment, etc., and I'm giving it free rein to be used, not only do I get to learn and get feedback from what that's doing, but I have a significant advantage and I'm much more consistent than the people who don't have that self-given permission and have this really long checklist to check off in order to play freely, which, as you come all the way full circle, what if you don't is the answer.
Okay, I've got to just ask this. I know the answer, I believe, but I've got to ask it just because, again, we've got a plethora of fans and big wide audience. We're not just talking about elite performers here. Anyone can give themselves the freedom to allow their best to occur, whether you're a club golfer or whether you're a PGA Tour or whatever professional. Yes,
you can. If you understand your brain and you're training your mind in a way where you're understanding these things, where you're removing the external things that need to come your way in order to give yourself that permission to play freely, anybody can pursue more of what they want more freely. And I don't want to make that sound like it's super easy and the flick of a switch, because it's not. But it is available to all of us if we are willing to do a little bit of inner work and a little bit of self-reflection, and then perhaps do a little bit of work. We are, when people tell me like, well, people can't change, I'm like, that's all we're designed to do, is to change, right? Everything that we do in our lives, we are constantly changing in one way or another. If we direct that change in an intentional way, because we understand what's going on underneath, now I can move that in the directions that I want to go, which doesn't produce a guarantee, but it sure does stack the deck in my favor.
It all starts with a supercomputer, folks.
It sure does.
Okay, it's called Golf Beneath the Surface. Tell folks where they can get this book, please, Raymond.
You can scoop that book wherever books are sold, major bookstores, anywhere online. If you just Google Golf Beneath the Surface, you'll find it. It's on Amazon, anywhere you can find it.
And they can learn from you there. But if they want to learn from you directly, tell folks how to find you, Raymond.
You can find me at my website, which is btsmindset.com. BTS Beneath the Surface. Some really on the mark branding, if I do say so myself, Mark. Okay. You can also catch me. I have a podcast also entitled Golf Beneath the Surface, co-hosted with my good friend Chase Cooper, who's an outstanding instructor and real curious golf member. And you can maybe catch me on Twitter at BTS_mindset, but only occasionally. I have a very sparing relationship with social media.
Right. Really smart, given what we've talked about. Yeah. Raymond, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the time. You've changed people's lives on the show. And for that, I'm very appreciative.
Mark, thank you so much for having me. Please let me know how I can be of value to you and the listeners in the future.